So there was a little disagreement early on about how much we should work and how hard we should work in light of, and I think Bernie was right in his suggesting that we take more time off from each other, off from the drugs, off from the whole thing.
For years, the Eagles were portrayed as rock's perfect machine, smooth harmonies, massive success, and unity behind the scenes. But that image hid something far darker, and Don Felder has stayed silent about it. Until now. At 77, Felder is finally telling the story he was never allowed to tell. The power grabs, the money disputes, the friendships that turned into legal notices, and the moment he was fired by facts, no filters, no protection. He doesn't need the Eagles anymore. But the truth does. And what Felder reveals changes everything fans thought they knew. In 1974, Don Felder joined the Eagles as a guitarist and almost immediately reshaped the band's sound. He brought a harder edge to their music, blending rock intensity with the country influences that had defined their earlier albums. What Felder contributed went beyond technical skill. He added personality, texture, and eventually the soul of what would become the most famous guitar solo in the band's history. That legacy was sealed with the 1976 release of Hotel California. The song began as a simple demo Felder recorded at his Malibu home on a 12-string guitar. Its now iconic solo, both precise and deeply emotional, introduced Felder to millions of fans. But that same success also placed him at the center of a power struggle he would ultimately lose. Behind the scenes, the Eagles operated under a rigid hierarchy. Don Henley and Glenn Frey held near total control, deciding everything from songwriting direction and tour set lists to how profits were divided. Though Felder co-wrote and performed some of the band's most important material, he had little say in decisions. The image of Harmony masked a group driven by ambition, functioning more like a corporation than a band. Felder refused to quietly accept that imbalance. He began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were Henley and Frey receiving a larger share of the income when the band's success was built collectively? Why were the creative ideas of other members routinely dismissed or tightly controlled? Those questions were never answered. Instead, they were interpreted as challenges to authority. Felder was labeled difficult to work with, though his real demand was simple: fairness. Tensions only deepened when the Eagles reunited in 1994 for Hell Freezes Over. Felder remained excluded from financial decisions while continuing to perform. The atmosphere grew increasingly hostile, and in 2001 the conflict reached its breaking point. Felder was fired without a meeting or a personal explanation. The message arrived by fax. In that moment, he lost more than a job. He lost his place within the legacy he had helped create. Felder fought back through the courts, filing a lawsuit against Henley and Frey for breach of contract, wrongful termination, and unfair profit distribution. The case drew widespread media attention, exposing internal divisions fans had never seen. Overnight, Felder went from creative partner to outsider. While Henley and Frey continued to steer the Eagles as a powerful brand, Felder was reduced to the role of a former member, his contributions increasingly minimized. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 2007, with financial details kept private. But the dispute was never just about money. For Felder, it was about recognition. He didn't want to rejoin the Eagles. He wanted acknowledgement as a vital part of their story, not a footnote erased from the history he helped write. After leaving the Eagles and emerging from years of legal conflict, Don Felder didn't fade into the background. Instead, in 2008, he chose to tell his story on his own terms with the release of his memoir, Heaven and Hell: My Life in the Eagles, 1974 to 2001. The book offered an unfiltered insider account of his years inside one of the most successful bands in history, and it immediately sparked controversy. Felder didn't simply revisit old memories. He laid bare what he described as years of manipulation, imbalance, and quiet resentment within the group. Writing in a direct, unsparing voice, he made no effort to soften his bitterness or shield anyone from criticism. Chapter by chapter, he described a band increasingly controlled by Glenn Frey and Don Henley, while the other members were gradually sidelined. What Felder documented went beyond personal grievances. His account read like a case study in how power operates inside a global music empire. The reaction was swift. Don Henley and the Eagles' legal team accused Felder of violating contractual agreements by revealing internal details. A countersuit followed, seeking damages and attempting to block portions of the audiobook release. At that point, the conflict was no longer about songs or performances. It was about control of the narrative. For Felder, the memoir became a way to reclaim his place in the band's history. He detailed moments when his contributions were dismissed in meetings and described tours where he felt less like a bandmate and more like an employee reporting to two bosses. That sense of exclusion echoed throughout the book. Yet Heaven and Hell didn't present Felder as blameless. He openly admitted to being short-tempered, emotionally reactive, and at times so drained that he considered walking away altogether. Those admissions gave the book its credibility. Rather than a one-sided attack, it read as the testimony of someone writing from a wound that had never healed and refusing to hide it. Public reaction was divided. Some critics accused Felder of reopening old wounds for attention. Others saw the memoir as a necessary exposure of how even legendary bands can operate under harsh, corporate-like structures where creativity bows to authority. In interviews, Felder maintained that he had actually restrained himself. He insisted the book was not meant to destroy anyone, suggesting that if he had wanted to be truly damaging, the story could have been far harsher. More than a decade later, Felder has not backed away from his account. He continues to describe Heaven and Hell as his truth, unaltered and unapologetic. He accepts the consequences of speaking openly and has never revised his perspective to ease anyone else's discomfort. The book stands not just as a musician's memoir, but as a portrait of a legendary band governed by power dynamics where silence came at a cost Felder was no longer willing to pay. In the aftermath, relationships within the Eagles grew colder. Don Henley publicly disagreed with Felder's version of events, but avoided detailed rebuttal. Joe Walsh and Timothy B. Schmidt stayed largely neutral, neither confirming nor denying the claims. Felder remained resolute. In his view, if he hadn't spoken up, the real story of what happened inside the Eagles would have remained untold. Even after his departure from the Eagles, Don Felder never chose silence or retreat. When that chapter closed, he didn't chase his former spotlight or attempt to relive past triumphs. Instead, he moved forward quietly, returning to the one language that had always belonged to him: music. In 2012, he released his solo album, Road to Forever. It wasn't framed as a grand comeback, but as a statement of independence. The record proved he could still write, play, and shape a musical project on his own terms. Its songs were deeply personal, reflecting themes of loss, betrayal, change, and the hard work of moving on. That sense of creative freedom continued in 2019 with American Rock and Roll, a collaborative album that bridged generations. Featuring artists such as Slash, Mick Fleetwood, Sammy Hagar, and Chad Smith, the project confirmed that Felder had not only endured on his own, but had earned lasting respect among his peers. Free from internal power struggles, he became the center of his own work. Since 2010, Felder has maintained a steady touring schedule. While he no longer plays stadiums, he continues to draw loyal audiences at theaters, festivals, and classic rock events across the country. On stage, Hotel California remains a constant part of his set list, but Felder balances it with newer material, reinforcing that his identity isn't frozen in the past. Another milestone came in 2025 with The Vault, 50 years of music. Rather than a simple retrospective, The album serves as a carefully curated excavation of his creative history, featuring unreleased demos that were refined and completed with intention. The collection moves fluidly between classic rock and introspective ballads, with guest appearances from Steve Lukather, David Paich, and Joseph Williams of Toto, further evidence of Felder's continued relevance and respect within the industry. Beyond recording and touring, Felder has invested his time in education and community work. He has led guitar workshops, participated in songwriting and performance panels, and supported free music education programs for young people. For him, music has never been just a profession. It's a way to connect, mentor, and pass something meaningful forward. In February 2025, Felder experienced a health scare during a performance on the Rock Legends cruise. In the middle of Tequila Sunrise, he was forced to leave the stage and was taken to a medical facility. Doctors later determined the cause was severe dehydration brought on by difficult weather conditions. After a short recovery, Felder personally reassured fans that he was fine and intended to return to performing. The incident served as a reminder that at 77, his body demands more care, and each appearance is chosen more carefully. Still, Felder has never treated age as a reason to slow down creatively. He continues to write, record, and perform, not to cling to relevance, but to affirm that his voice still matters. More than 2 decades after leaving the Eagles, he no longer needs the band to define his place in music. Today, Don Felder no longer speaks with anger about the past. But his long silence over the last 2 decades was never about forgetting. It was a conscious choice to move forward differently. In interviews between 2024 and 2025, Felder began reflecting more openly on his inner life, his perspective after conflict, and why he has no desire to reopen old battles, even though he still holds the details to do so. When he once said that being fired from the Eagles was a blessing, it sounded almost casual, but the truth behind it was anything but simple. For Felder, stepping away from an environment defined by control wasn't pure loss. It became a process of rediscovering his own value. It was the moment he learned the difference between collaboration and obedience. After his dismissal, Felder made an attempt to reconcile with Glenn Frey, but the effort went unanswered. When Frey passed away in 2016, Felder attended the memorial service and spoke with restraint and respect. Years later, he acknowledged the reality plainly. He wasn't happy about Glenn's death, but he wouldn't pretend they had resolved their differences. There was distance between them, and it remained. It wasn't bitterness. It was honesty. His relationship with Don Henley followed a similar pattern. The two have remained distant, interacting only with basic courtesy when their paths crossed at industry events. Felder has never launched public attacks against Henley, even after Frey's death. He has admitted that he still disagrees with how the band was run, but he no longer lives there emotionally. Choosing the present for Felder wasn't avoidance. It was setting boundaries. Unlike the period following his memoir, Felder no longer revisits old conflicts for attention. He speaks selectively now, focusing less on drama and more on what it means to survive creative trauma. Forgiveness, as he explains it, isn't an act meant to comfort others. It's a way to stop carrying weight that no longer serves him. Letting go isn't denial. It's a deliberate end to a cycle. In workshops and seminars, Felder often discusses the psychological toll of working in creative environments where individual contributions go unrecognized. He describes it as a form of invisible burnout, one that quietly erodes identity over time. His advice to younger artists extends beyond technique, urging them to protect autonomy and self-definition while navigating collaborative spaces. Since 2020, Felder has appeared more frequently in documentaries, podcasts, and music-focused programs, always striking the same balance. He doesn't rewrite history, but he refuses to weaponize it. He doesn't deny that he was wronged, yet he avoids drowning others in judgment. That restraint gives his words weight. Journalists still push for untold details, but Felder holds his line. Curiosity, he believes, doesn't entitle anyone to everything. Control of the narrative for him is an act of self-respect. When he speaks now, it's either to clarify or to close. Forgiveness hasn't softened what happened to him. It doesn't erase the fact that he was pushed out of something he helped build. But it has given him something more enduring than vindication: peace. From there, he continues to work, perform, and live, without needing anyone else to correct the record for him. When Felder reflects on his legacy, one moment always returns: the guitar solo on Hotel California. Not because he's clinging to the past, but because he knows what it represents. That solo, written alone in his room on a 12-string guitar without producers or studio polish, helped turn the Eagles into global icons. It was pure emotion, discipline, and identity distilled into sound. And no matter what followed, that contribution remains undeniable. Don Felder didn't write the lyrics to Hotel California, but the instrumental melody he sent to Glenn Frey and Don Henley became the foundation of a song that defined an era. When he looks back on it, he avoids grand claims. He says he simply did the best he could at the time, and it happened to endure. In his solo shows, Hotel California almost always closed the night. He played it much as it was originally recorded, out of respect for the song and for the audience who came to hear what they remembered. He never tried to reinvent the famous solo. Keeping it intact was his way of honoring the work. That respect is shared by fellow musicians. Artists like Slash, Joe Satriani, and Steve Lukather may not weigh in publicly on his past, but they continued to record with him, and that quiet choice speaks volumes. Felder doesn't enter the studio to settle old scores. He goes there to do what he's always done: write, play, and create. The Vault. 50 years of music isn't a nostalgia project, but a reminder that he isn't defined by one song or one band. In his workshops, he rarely talks about the Eagles. Instead, he talks about discipline, patience, and being ready when opportunity arrives. To younger musicians, his value lies not in fame, but in resilience. He doesn't campaign for credit or wait for apologies. As he put it in a 2025 interview, if his role isn't written into the official record, it lives in the music. At 77, Don Felder may no longer tour on a massive scale, but when he steps on stage and plays, the room still goes quiet. He isn't part of the Eagles anymore, but the music he helped create continues to speak for itself.